folks, Jason from the Surf Hermits here. Welcome back to episode 2 of Creative Waves. This week we're going to talk more about Chick Corea's cheap but good advice for playing music in a group. Hope last week was helpful to you. Hope you got a chance to try some of those concepts. This week we got a couple new concepts for you, so stay tuned. And here we go with another episode of Creative Waves right here on the Pi Records Broadcast Network. Hey, let's go back to Chick Corea's cheap but good advice for playing music in a group. And we don't have to take that completely literally. We want to understand that while this applies very well to playing in a group of musicians, most of these apply very much to our own habits, to our own inclinations when we're playing music by ourselves, when we're recording, when we're writing music, all of those things. So it applies across the board, in my opinion, anyway. Last week we talked about play only what you hear, and if you don't hear anything, don't play anything. And those are heavy and amazingly deep concepts, and we kind of skimmed the surface of those. If you have any ideas about those, any other things that cropped up for you that those could mean for you, then comment down below and we'll have a discussion about it. That'd be pretty cool. Today, however, we're going to move on to number 3, which is don't let your fingers and limbs just wander. Place them intentionally, which is a pretty interesting one for sure. Again, it has some depth. I think on the surface level, it means play with some intentionality, right? Don't just randomly throw stuff around. If you're playing what you hear, then put your hands down to create what you hear, which is a deliberate act in a sense. Now, to me, this is interesting advice coming from Chick because Chick's an improviser, right? It doesn't mean that you have to have an idea fully formed that you have to apply to the instrument. In his case, the piano, guitar, drums, or whatever. It just means that play with some authority, play with some confidence, mean what you say what you mean, in a sense, musically, right? Don't be afraid to say it. Play what you hear, right? It all sort of comes back to that in a sense. But for me, it's interesting because when I play a lot of times, especially when I play drums, which is sort of my main instrument, I really do let things go where they want to go. And maybe there's a fine distinction of letting things loose or letting things wander, as he puts it, in his actual statement. Don't improvise, or don't let your fingers and limbs just wander. Yeah, don't noodle, right? No noodling. What's that? What was the sign in, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, in the guitar store or whatever? No noodling, right? And again, I mean, I'm guilty of it as anyone, I'm sure, but we've all been in those bands where it's like someone just likes to noodle all the time, and it grinds eventually, right? It's about leaving space, even just sort of psychologically while you're setting up your instruments, if we're talking about noodling specifically. But in music as well, sometimes we can noodle, even while we're playing with other people, while we're soloing, while we're playing a melody. There's a real razor's edge between like exploration and improvisation and cool things that happen and noodling around just because your fingers will do that, so that's a boundary that we all have to find for ourselves, and sometimes people will find it for us and tell us which is okay too, right? Input is good from all directions, but nonetheless, don't let them wander. Mean what you say what you mean. That's what I really take out of that. And I also take out of that sort of how rules apply. Again, I'm a longtime martial artist, so I think in those terms. But whenever a rule is presented to you in martial arts, especially things that are quite deep, like Tai Chi, where there's like years of work in there, whenever something's presented to you as a rule, what's actually being presented to you is a spectrum of possibilities. You know, when they say that you should sit, not bend, it doesn't mean that you can never bend and you should always sit. It just means that through doing those sorts of postural activities, you learn something about the body, so that when you do bend or you can't sit, then you're in a position to be able to work in those conditions as well. So a rule always implies its opposite, in a sense. Again, it's the basic operation of yin and yang, in a sense. We can't have one thing without the other. A rule, by setting out a rule that creates conditions that are not the rule, it's just how it has to be. Otherwise, there's no point in having a rule, because we would only be doing that one thing. So I think there's great value, actually, at least in certain circumstances, in letting your fingers and your limbs wander, for playing completely without intentionality, because then you see what flows out naturally, right? And only through that process can I feel that you can really start to come back to intentionality again. There's an old saying, you know, at first it was just a mountain, and then it was something much more than a mountain. And then when I had learned so much more, it simply became a mountain again. Old kind of, again, martial artsy kind of saying, where it's like, it's something just basic, just do it. And it's like, wow, this has so much meaning, oh my God. And then really it comes back down to just getting things done, right? So I think it's that way with that sort of cutting ourselves loose with our limbs and our fingers. Yeah, we should be able to be in control of everything, but control implies lack of control. And really, when we think about some of the greatest players that we can think about, they're people that could just let it flow out, like almost uninhibited. You know, there wasn't a control mechanism forcing these things out. It was something that was just happening, that they were allowing to happen. Almost discovering it as it happened, right? Think of Hendrix. I mean, there was something wild about how he played. And I'm sure he had practiced much in his life and all of those things, but there was almost something raw coming out of his soul that, you know, he couldn't have stopped if he wanted to, much less, you know, meticulously constructed and pushed out into the world. So, you know, not to contradict Chick, but to maybe add to that advice, yeah, there's a place to be intentional. Don't let things just noodle around. But there's you know, 1 degree away from noodling is something very special too, that is amazing and profound, and is where, in a way, we're all trying to get as players, where it just comes out effortlessly and spontaneously, and the right thing just appears, and you're as surprised and amazed by it as anyone else listening to it. That for me is the ideal state of playing, one that is almost never reached, but sometimes when it comes out, I mean, it's almost addictive in its in how it feels when that happens. So yeah, don't let it wander, but let it wander. Sorry, chick. Number 4, don't improvise on endlessly. Play something with intention, develop it or not, but then end off, take a break. Yeah, this is pretty closely related to number 3, where we just don't let things wander. This is more focused in a sense, though, and as someone who's produced a lot of records with other players, like for me, I learned about guitar through producing guitar players and trying to get something out of them onto certain recordings. And I've been so lucky to work with such great players. One of the first players I ever started working with when I was 17 years old, Mark Nickel. We kind of came up together musically in a lot of ways, but he was always a really strong player from the very beginning. And I was lucky enough to be able to use him on a lot of different recordings. And, you know, he just kind of had it. In a way, it set the tone for what I wanted to hear later in life. And one of the things I realized when I worked with other players is that sometimes they didn't know when to stop. And it's not that they weren't playing good things, but there was a certain quality of breathing, is how I think of it, that happened in a good player's playing, where, you know, a phrase would happen and then there's time to breathe. You have to inhale and you have to exhale. Not literalistically in exact proportions, but musically, where there's ups, there's downs, there's intense passages, there's times when we reflect, right? And that all sounds very fancy, but nonetheless, when we hear something that really hits us, or at least when I do, there is that quality of space, or even if it's not actual musical space, there's a pacing to it, there's a phrasing to it, right? Phrasing is, a phrase is an important musical concept, where it's an idea that has a start and sort of a finish. You know, even if it blends into other things, it's a bit of a unit there. And I think that's very much what Chick's talking about here, where it's like, let it form ideas, because then there are these bite-sized packages that the mind can sort of enjoy, right? If it's just kind of this endless trail off into the distance of things, you know, sometimes that's enjoyable, you know, as a jazz listener or a fusion listener, you know, it's kind of cool when they can just go off like that. But, you know, if you think about like a David Gilmour guitar solo, like there's something beautiful and breathing and spacious about it. Or Mark Knopfler, there's like such great phrasing in there. It's amazing. So allow things to conclude. Things have beginnings, things have ends. That's the natural state of the universe, in a sense, right? So why should our music be any different than that? It can't be eternal. No one would want to listen to it past a certain amount. I mean, if you think about it, we have weirdly kind of short ideas musically, you know, for what popular music is. 3 minutes, you know, that's a pretty short thing. Like a Return to Forever song might be 9 minutes or 11 minutes or whatever, and, you know, jazz tunes longer. And there's time and space for those sorts of things. But within the context of whatever you happen to be working on, find where the spaces are in those things, right? Surf is a great example. Like Misery Lou, for example. You know, you get tremolo picking, it's filling it up almost as much as you can, but there's the space that lets things regather themselves for it again. You know, and it kind of trails off for a second there, musically. Important to listen and to hear those things, because then we can play what we hear, right? And if we don't hear it, should we play it? Well, I think sometimes we should, but nonetheless, play what you hear. And that brings it all back to the intentionality of it, right? We want to explore, we want to be free, like in number 3, where we don't let things wander. But yeah, we should, at least in our practice or experimentally, we should wander and see what that does. You know, what good things that brings us, what bad things that brings us. What does that sound like when we do that? How do other people react? How do the other people in your band react when you take these concepts and work with them? Always interesting to see what the result is, right? That's what science is in a sense. We set out a hypothesis and we, you know, observe the results. So intentionality comes with unintentionality, and we need to do both to develop both. And ultimately it should come into something greater. That's a melding of those two. It's both of those things. It's those things when they need to happen. Intentionality is great in certain things. Unintentionality is great in certain things. And each thing happens in its own place. And our life's work as musicians and creative people is trying to get a finer and finer understanding of where those places are. So by working through these concepts and applying them to your own playing and your own music, that's how we learn these things. That's how we start to put these things together. That's how we develop our own voice as creative people. And kudos to Chick for laying this out for us. And we'll talk about more in further episodes of Creative Waves right here on the Pi Records Intergalactic Trans-Universal Cross-Dimensional YouTube network.